So the question is from Upside Strength, and it reads, what are the biggest differences between how traditional erg, parentheses, rower training is done for a standard 2K? And what have you come up with through your extensive experience, readings, and testings? Can't wait to hear more about that. So I think the question is, how do rowers classically train, and how do we do it differently? So I'm going to touch on how rowers traditionally do it, but I'll also touch on how we used to do it, because a lot of the training models that we used years ago, a lot of them came from our experience in different sports. I come from a track and field background. Kyle Ruth comes from a swimming background. I was a rower for a period as well. So we kind of merged all of those and used that in our CrossFit training approach. But since then, we've thrown out most of those training models, and we only use very little pieces. So traditionally, the way that we did things is we would take an event and we would reduce it to a system of like physiological limitations or roadblocks that you might encounter in that event. So we would have an athlete do a time trial, and then we would create training zones, paces, blocks targeted based on those scores. And while that approach actually worked pretty well, we found that it wasn't the best application. That approach makes athletes really conditioned, but it doesn't always prepare them for the sport or the time trial, because in reality, if you take something like a 2K, it doesn't fit in a neat box. While you might try and classify a 2K as like an aerobic power test, or you might look at a marathon as a test of aerobic endurance, that's not reflective of reality. If I'm running a marathon race, let's say part of it's aerobic, but I'm starting to fatigue, and what if I do pickups or sprints and I'm surging and I'm going up a hill? I'm going to desaturate oxygen from the muscle, and I'm going to produce more than 4 millimoles of lactate. Would we really consider that aerobic in that regard? Probably not. So if we were to just train with this targeted block and strict classification-based work, we're not going to prepare for those demands. Some athletes also target a different way, where a lot of their training is just based on the sport. What do you experience when you're doing a 2K? You're breathing under high respiration, you're under a lot of fatigue, you're under a lot of pain. So let's just replicate that in training all the time. That prepares athletes for the sport, no doubt, and it creates those psychological factors, but it usually leaves them under-conditioned. So both of those approaches have positives and negatives. What we've tried to do is kind of sandwich those approaches into what we'd call the limiter bridge performance model. So we're trying to reconcile those issues by taking the physiological pieces that we need to address and the sport specific, and addressing both of those simultaneously within our periodization structures. I actually just recorded a video, it's the first one in this series, where we went really into detail on that. So I won't really hatch that all out again. That's also covered pretty extensively in the New Energy System course and book. But I will touch on some other thoughts. So another thing that we've added or layered into that model is physiological limitation training. Me and another athlete could get the exact same times on a 2K, and you might think with those classic approaches that we should train the same way, but in reality, we might have achieved that goal in a completely different way. So by using tests with NIRS, near-infrared spectroscopy, or we use the Moxie monitors for that, Omega Wave, or all these different tools, we could identify physiological limiters that are actually creating the rate-limiting steps in athletes' workouts. By doing that, we could target the lowest hanging fruit, and then the training becomes a little bit more clear-cut. Do the sport-specific and speed preservation training that they need, and address the physiological limitations, and then bridge the gap or take like an ends-to-middle approach, and you kind of take care of that. Within that, you could also use auto-regulated training. Oftentimes, we underdose or overdose workouts. As coaches, we often have these obsessions with numbers. You might see like 5 sets, 6 sets, 8 sets, 10. But I've even noticed myself, it's that like numerology approach where you think because it looks good on paper that that's going to make sense for the athlete. But in reality, that's just like being fooled by randomness, or letting yourself think you have control over something that's fluctuating day to day and is more or less completely random. So we could use auto-regulated training to find where an athlete's physiological systems tap out on a given day. So, for example, I could create an auto-regulated training session to improve oxygen utilization in the muscle and have athletes repeat a fixed intensity and rest period, so controlling intensity and density, and let them auto-regulate the volume when the physiological systems could no longer compensate with that load. That way we're always getting the perfect stimulus for the workouts, and we're not overdosing or underdosing workouts, both of which take us farther away from the goal long term. I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say there.